Thank you again to our keynote speakers. Our first panel discussion of the day will dive into the critical topic of resilient urban development, mitigating climate change risk in modern cities. This session will explore how cities can adapt and migrate the impacts of climate change. Moderating this panel is Suhail, joined by industry experts Gunnar, Eric, and Heidi. Let's give them a warm welcome.
Morning, everyone. So we'll just get started. So, morning again, and thank you for joining us for Resilient Urban Development, Mitigating Climate Change in Modern Cities. I'm confident that today's conversation will be both insightful and timely for those of you interested in this topic. So with over half the world's population living in cities, urban areas are increasingly vulnerable to extreme weather events and rising sea levels and other climate-related risks. So what we're trying to do is, these events are becoming a lot more frequent and severe, as you may have noted over the summer in New York as well. And to cope with these changes, cities must adapt and build resilience into their core development. Resilient urban development is about creating cities that can withstand and recover from climate shocks while continuing to provide essential services, protect populations, and support economic growth at the same time. It touches everything from infrastructure, housing, to energy systems, transportation, social equity, a lot more than you would imagine. So without significant strides in resilience, the social, economic, and environmental costs can be catastrophic if we don't get this under control. However, with the right direction, with the right strategies, right leadership, right policies, we can create more resilient, livable, sustainable, and inclusive cities. Today, we have the privilege of hearing from three independent and incredible speakers who are leaders in their field. I have Gunnar Branson to my left, who's the CEO of AFIRE. He'll offer insights into how global investors are currently approaching resilient urban development. I also have Eric Fang, principal at Perkins Eastman, who will discuss how design and urban planning are evolving to meet their challenges. And I have Heidi Theunissen, who's an associate principal of sustainability at Buro Happold, who will share her expertise on integrating sustainability into urban projects. Together, they'll help us explore these strategies and innovations that are shaping resilient urban environments. All right? So let's get started with some fundamental questions. So to the panel, I would ask, resilient urban development touches on multiple sectors. You have infrastructure, social equity. What do you believe should be the most pressing aspects of resilience that cities should address first, and why?
That's a tough question to answer.
I didn't think it was easy.
And in great part because you're saying, what should we address first?
Yeah.
And I think to a certain extent, we're getting to that point where first, second, third is no longer as relevant as perhaps it was earlier in this process. Right now, it's all of the above, or feels like a version of that everything is a priority. But I do think that if you boil down kind of the imperative or the burning platform right now, we are now approaching, in the last couple of years, an accelerating pricing of risk. It's interesting, when I ask investors, and a lot of times I do in surveys, if they believe that the values of assets that they're acquiring right now are priced for climate change risk. In other words, a storm coming and knocking it down, or the whole region having a problem, or whatever else, if that is baked into their portfolio's pricing. And over 85% believe no, it is not. Wow. Believe that they are exposed to significant risk. Now, I've gotten the same answer to that question for a few years. That question is now changing because insurance companies have decided that they can't afford the risk anymore without raising the price. So what you've seen in some coastal regions, but frankly across the entire United States, even in non-coastal regions, is a fast accelerating rise in premiums. And you're seeing doubling, tripling. Right now you're seeing just unbelievable rises in insurance premiums in places like southern Florida, which makes sense given the incredible risk that we see every year. We're now in the height of the season where that risk is very expensive. It means that that housing, that commercial property is far more expensive than we have accounted for so far. That also means that the value of those assets has to go down in order for it to account for the risk, which means my $100 million building is now worth less. That is forcing change. And we've only begun to see that change in terms of where institutional money goes. Okay. And we're going to see the repercussions of that. So as we look at this, we have to realize that resilience is going to be job number one for a lot of people. We're now at a point where the damage and the risk is so high that we have to build for resilience, not just in our buildings, but in our infrastructure and in our society, to understand this is our new reality right now. Yep. And we're just at the beginning. It's going to get worse before it gets better.
Thank you. Eric, you want to share some thoughts?
Yeah, I think that that's the first step to plan for the risk. I think the thing, and I agree with you that all of the above, everything, you can't leave anything behind, but the essential, I think, approach needs to be to account for this risk, the changes that are forecast in pretty much every project that's being done anywhere. And I hate to say this, but I think a lot of planning. I'm an architect, I'm a planner. Nobody likes planning. I mean, my mother doesn't even like planning, but it has to be done. And I think there's a couple of reasons. One is to accommodate and to account for all of the new realities of, pricing the risk. The other thing is the realities of, future realities of planning, climate change are really not a sure thing. We know that the climate's changing. We know that there are certain effects on coastal areas, areas out west in the U.S. with wildfires and so forth. But, much of it is very variable, particularly in the long term. If the Greenland ice sheet melts, the seas go up this much. If the ice in Antarctica, the polar caps, they kind of crumble earlier than they go up this much. So the planning has to be done, has to be redone, has to be revisited. And then the planning is also essential to make sure that the money comes out, the risk is priced in, the money comes out, that people aren't left behind, and not just people, but then whole areas and communities. And we don't end up with disinvestment on a massive scale that causes social disruption. So.
Heidi, can you give us a sequence instead of saying everything at the same time?
I would come from a completely different perspective. So my background is in architecture as well. I work for an engineering company now. But when we look at the increased risk of climate change now, I think it becomes increasingly important to consider, one of the three sustainability cores, basically. There's environmental sustainability, there's social sustainability, and economic sustainability. I think there's an aspect of the social sustainability that is largely at risk, and we don't necessarily discuss the question of equity so much. There in urban environments, there are large bodies of people who do not necessarily have agency, they don't have a voice, and they are disproportionately affected by whatever is happening in terms of climate change. They're highly at risk, and our interventions through developing, through putting together risk management strategies, flood management, and so forth, it does not always consider those that are most at risk. And I think for me, the focus should be increasingly on that group and on the equity aspect of the whole sustainability discussion. Yeah.
Fabulous. So we are not going to solve this alone. We rely on partnerships. So just to follow up on that question, so as cities grow and face increasing climate-related challenges, how do you envision collaboration between public and private sectors evolving to meet these demands that we are facing?
Well, I think it's imperative, certainly the partnership. Neither party is able to do it by themselves. Financial markets are funny in that they react in a particular way to things because all the various parties in a financial market are behaving in self-interest. So the game is, how do you get that self-interest to be enlightened? So one of the fears I have around resilience is that there is a tipping point where the investors say, I can't put my money there because I don't see something positive. So we've already seen this in some low-lying areas, even on the East Coast of the United States, where whole communities are now worth nothing. And they're worth nothing not because they're underwater, but because there's too many flood days. And people can't get to their buildings anymore. And when that happens, it happens quickly. We have a tendency to think about climate change as being slow and gradual over time. And a lot of people will say, well, in 20, 30, 40 years, maybe I'll have a problem. But the problem with investing is that you're not just investing for the term of your investment. You're not thinking, oh, I'm going to own this for 5, 7, 10 years, and then I'm out. So I only have to worry about 10 years. Well, actually, as an investor, you have to worry about the next 20 and possibly 30 years because you still have to sell that building at the end of the term. And when you no longer believe that someone's going to buy it, it's no longer worth anything. Think of a bank run. That's what we're potentially facing. And that's why the public and the private have to work together. In other words, we have to figure out a way to make these communities resilient over time, and that means an infrastructure build. That means partnering on infrastructure build. That means toughening whole communities, not just the financial class, but making sure that everyone is going to be able to succeed in a market that's a little wetter than it was before, or a little hotter, a lot hotter, or without water in some parts of the country. So it really is a combination of intense government work, intense partnerships, public and private, in order to make sure that you have thriving communities that are resilient. In other words, you can't have just poor people, you can't have just rich people. You can't separate that out anymore. We have to bring them together, and they have to be able to work together. And some of our cities, our older cities, already function that way. It's very hard to kill a city. Over the history of humankind, there's maybe a dozen cities that no longer exist. They tend to evolve. And they have crises, they have problems, they have changes. But if that is a healthy city that has a mix of use, a mix of incomes, a mix of peoples, they're able to solve those problems. And that's why you need that public-private partnership. It's no longer creating a Disneyland version of what a city is, where it's all rich people and nice and clean, which is great, it's fun, but you need everybody. And you need everyone to be able to succeed, and you need to be able to see a long-term vision together.
Eric, you want to share some thoughts?
Yeah, I think I agree. Public-private partnerships are essential, and I have a couple of illustrated examples. But I think that the one thing that's critical is the public really needs to lead, and I hate to say that as well. Just as planning is essential, the thing about climate change, the effects of water, heat, fire, et cetera, risk, it doesn't end at the property boundary, right? It doesn't even end at the city boundary and beyond state boundaries. So you need all levels of government. You need that longer, past 7, 10, 30 years. You need the public sector to look past that. You need to also look at infrastructure that connects everything, right? It's not just about one particular piece of property or even just a particular neighborhood. And so that view, that foresight, that level of marshaling kind of resources and so forth can only be done on the public side. And these are a couple of examples, where I'm going to skip around actually, where we've worked. And this city of Nashville, I think Gunnar mentions a very important point where even in places where there is high interest, this is in the East Bank of Nashville, which is one of the hottest property markets in the U.S., particularly during the pandemic in the Sun Belt in Tennessee. And there's a lot of interest. There's an explosion of development pressure in downtown. A lot of people kind of circling around. You may be familiar with this area. And the private developers and private property owners were looking for the city for leadership so they could set a template so they'd have some certainty for how their investments could evolve over time. They were not going to abandon this area, risk or no risk. And so that's what we've tried to create, a vision, a framework for transportation, for actually how to live with the water, not to keep the water out, but keep the water out in certain places, accommodate it in other places, because you can't beat Mother Nature, and do that in a way that you get multiple benefits. This area was really very, very dominated by floodplain issues, but to try to help investors, property owners, current community members envision how life could work with that future, with those types of risks.
Thank you for sharing that. Heidi, you have some thoughts to share?
I think, coming from a very pragmatic perspective, the partnerships, public-private partnerships, are so important from a funding perspective, financing these, investment opportunities, and I think, when we think about investment in resilience and sustainability, it's clear that somebody has to pay for it. And it could be a combination of local government, federal government, but the funding opportunities that come also from private investors are absolutely important. In addition to this kind of financial aspect, there's also the real need for, when it comes to stakeholder engagement, it is so important to have these partnerships. No single firm, no single consultant, no single regulatory body can actually bring together the body of information that is required to make sound decisions about the future resilience of a city. And so by having this sort of public and private engagement, we create opportunities where we can have stakeholder involvement in all of the aspects of design, of resilient design of the urban areas.
And remember, too, that the cities are in competition as well. So these cities are competing for talent, for populations, for businesses. Mm-hmm. And the way to compete is to have something like what you're seeing on the screen right now, to see that kind of resilience there. Those are the cities that are going to win. Those are the cities that are going to attract capital. They're going to attract financial capital. And remember, too, financial capital adapts to a lot of things. As much as we like to yell and scream about new rules or regulatory things getting in the way, we always adapt to it. Once the public says this is what we want to have a more resilient waterfront, we'll complain and we'll say it costs a lot more money, and gee, I'd rather just build more stuff. We'll adapt. And actually, once we adapt, we end up making more money. So at the end of the day, cities that are able to compete and see this not as a defensive move, but an offense move, it's a way to attract more capital, more business, a healthier population, et cetera, et cetera. The politicians win because they have a successful city, the population wins because they have a beautiful, successful city. Everyone wins. And I hate saying win-win because it's the kind of thing that con men say to you all the time. But that's really what we're looking for here. And I think there's a tendency for us to think of it simply as, oh, we have to do something to defend ourselves, when actually it's, oh, this is an opportunity for Nashville to be a world-beating city. This is an opportunity for New York to not just maintain its status as a city, but to grow it and become even more powerful and more interesting and more exciting. And I think that gets missed sometimes. But public-private partnerships are really all about winning. They're not necessarily about imposing. Although the imposition is there, we adapt to it.
So no conversation today is complete without speaking about technology, AI, but just technology in general in real estate. So, from your various fields that you were in, investment, sustainability, urban design, what role do you see technology playing in creating more resilient cities? And is it impacting your work today, or do you foresee it will impact your work, the way you do business?
I will start on this. This is something I'm actually quite excited about, because the integration of technology into data capturing on the building scale, on the community scale, and so on. It gives us the opportunity to really, really understand our environments better. We have the emergence of so-called digital twins, where either a building or a building system or a community or a city can be represented in a digital and a transparent fashion that's kind of accessible. Big data is something that gives us the ability to predict what is going to happen and to react to that, and to also create futures that are favorable. And we see this in so many ways. Sensors capturing data in real time and reporting it. We have the so-called smart cities that are incredibly interconnected. We have the Internet of Things, which enables us as well to have real-time data capture and be able to understand our physical environment so much better, and can contribute to sort of our action regarding resilient design.
Eric, you got some thoughts?
Well, I think, yeah, you're absolutely right, Heidi. The emergence of information technology and climate science has done, incredible things. One is just the availability of data from us as practitioners. Just thinking back to the first work we did on Mayor Bloomberg's, first long-term plan after Hurricane Sandy, the amount of information that was proprietary, that was very slow in coming, that was very dear and costly, now is available at your fingertips, and much, much more sophisticated level of information at that. Second thing, it's democratized the information that's available, and so more people that used to be just professionals, practitioners at firms like our own, that had access to this information. But now it's available, much more widely. There are databases, flood projections, at-risk zones, so forth, that are available, made by state agencies, city agencies, which is incredible. Now, the flip side of that is data alone, and I've seen this working with technical specialists, doesn't solve everything. And sometimes there could be too much data. And this, I'm sorry, I'm kind of flipping your question on the head, but you really need a direction. You need to figure out what all these data points add up to. And that, I think, leads to the need for leadership, on planning and design scale. I'm going to bring it back to that. So,
we still need humans.
Forming consensus around data. So
we still need humans for now.
Still
need
it.
Good,
yes.
good.
Well, it's actually a very exciting time. Not just data, but everything down to materials science is shifting on us. But it is hard for us as human beings to trust and to change what we do. So really the challenge right now is not necessarily inventing more technology. It's how do we manage it? How do we think about it? How do we work with it? Also, we have to understand that technology does not necessarily help us from a resilience standpoint. Hurricane Sandy, we learned a lot. Some things we didn't learn. We're still building, the McMansions on the beach in New Jersey, which is insane. But all the data tells us not to do that, but we're still doing it. But what we learned from Sandy, I think there was one interesting thing about that and other hurricanes that have occurred, is that we are incredibly reliant on a networked technology basis. The buildings that came back the fastest after Hurricane Sandy were the buildings that had a magical piece of technology that has been overlooked, the 3-ring binder. So operations on a building-by-building level, in the old days, you'd have a bunch of 3-ring binders that would tell you what to do if something went wrong. The building managers that had those were able to take care of it. They understood what was going on. But we've been working really hard to put everything online because everything could change. And what happens in a hurricane? You can't get online. Not only that, we've also changed everything to digital currency. So you had credit cards that could be used, but the buildings in Lower Manhattan need diesel fuel to keep their generators going, and the folks that were delivering diesel fuel were working strictly on a cash basis. So the buildings that had $50,000 to $100,000 in cash in a lockbox somewhere, not in the basement, were able to keep their generators going and keep the pumps going. So as we think about technology, we also have to think about resilience. And we also have to think about what happens if we lose our connection to the data, which is most likely to happen in the scenarios that we're seeing. And we did learn from Hurricane Sandy to at least move the HVAC and all the systems up from the basement, thank goodness. But who knows what's going to happen next? And let's be ready for that. Let's think about how do we keep ourselves flexible, how do we keep ourselves resilient, and how do we stay connected to each other personally, even if the internet goes down.
You should have first asked how many people in the audience remember what a three-ring binder is.
Oh, I'm sorry. Do you know what a three-ring binder is? Are we okay on that?
I can put a picture up here on that, so like a fax machine, right? One of those sometimes, right? One of those are. No, see, these are such diverse ideas and thoughts, where the conversation evolved. Fantastic. So now, moving from broad general questions to very specific business, how you operate questions. So I'll start with Gunnar, and then we'll go to Heidi, and we'll come back to Eric. Okay, so Gunnar, you have a very broad view of global real estate investment landscape, right? Just because of the work that you do. So how are investors responding to the growing need for climate resilience in urban development?
Well, I mean, they're responding very quickly to the insurance input. It's telling them to change what they're doing and think about what they're doing. And we're still, at the beginning of this journey. But I think generally speaking, when you're talking about global capital, it is strongly influenced by what has been going on in Europe and Canada over the last 20 years. So even though you don't have the same regulatory regime in every country, the capital has to play according to certain rules. So ESG has really been driven to a certain extent from outside the United States. But when you think about where most institutional capital, think about it, it's pension plans, it's insurance companies, it's people that need to have good risk-adjusted returns over 10, 20, 30-year lifespans. And the people that do that investing on behalf of these insurance companies know that. They don't always act accordingly, but they do know that, and they do what they can to be able to do that. So almost universally, they very much believe that ESG is the way you make money. And when you think about those buildings that are truly green, not just greenwash, those buildings that are truly resilient, they get the highest rents. They get leased up the fastest. They become the most desirable. So it's seen as a key amenity to attract tenants and therefore to attract capital. And that is something that I think real estate is ahead of a lot of other industries over the last 20 years in terms of the work that we've already done. We're doing things now that 20 years ago people would go, are you crazy? Are you going to wear Birkenstocks and grow your hair long? I mean, real estate's not going to do that. Well, we're doing it now, and we're doing it in the United States. So I often caution people when they think about institutional investing, remember that they're not listening to the news as strongly as maybe others are. They're not listening to the politics. And the politics right now are, in some corners in the United States, that ESG is some sort of woke mind virus that's going to destroy us all and turn us into communists. I don't think that's true, but maybe that's because I'm woke and a communist. I don't know. I'm not, really. I don't wear Birkenstocks. I think they look hideous. But when you look at follow the money and follow where the risk-adjusted returns are, you take ESG seriously. When you follow that, you get excited about the idea of a net zero building. That is real for the long-term investor in a way that politicians can't possibly understand. So it's important to keep that separated in your own mind. It's tough, especially during election seasons, but there's like two worlds here of reality. And investors, the reality is, I want to make money not just today, tomorrow, but for the next 20, 30, 40 years. So how do I do that?
You separate the reality from the noise, essentially, right? So in your opinion, then there are no barriers to attracting investment capital into resilient urban projects, or? The
biggest barrier is debt. The biggest barrier is banks, and not just during this time frame where debt is mostly frozen or certainly is very sluggish. Banks tend to work according to an algorithm. It's very hard, even though the individuals within the banks may know the answer, it's very hard for them to operate that way. Things have to be proven out. Things have to be something that's systematized. So as you're innovating and changing and doing things that are different from the way we've done it for 100 years, the banks are going to be the last people to that party. So part of what's happening right now is we are expanding the amount of non-bank debt in the system. So that will help, but we've got a long way to go before that's there. So generally speaking, debt is in your way, and then the cities themselves get in your way. because we have zoning laws that have been on the books for 100 years plus that don't make sense. So to a certain extent, there is that public part, which is we've got to start getting real about what our city should be. And by the way, NIMBYism is just an extension of that. We've all decided that things are supposed to be the way they were in the 19th century. Well, that would be great, but we're not in the 19th century. We have other issues and we have to work through them. So everything from density issues to how wide our streets are, to how we deal with stormwater runoff, to all these details. Technically, we understand the answers, or we have at least a direction on the answers. The biggest problem is changing the public's view of this. And by public, that means government as well. So all of us have to understand where this is going, and that's the battle. That's what we have to do. That's the obstacle. And we're not going to win it just by saying these people are idiots. We have to help people understand what's at stake, and not just to the negative, but where the positive is, and what is it that we can win at. So, thank you, Mr. Gore, for freaking us all out. Now the next step is, what is that vision? And where are we going with this? And what are some of the practicalities of this? And what is that going to feel like and look like? And yeah, we're going to have to change our behaviors. And by the way, the one thing that people fear most, it used to be they fear most standing up in front of a group of people like yourself with a microphone in your hand and talking. And that is kind of scary. We're all a little nervous right now. But more frightening than that, more frightening than the dark, more frightening than, bugs and snakes, is having to change what you do. Even if what you do is miserable, we'll fight tooth and nail to keep from having to change it until the last possible minute.
So you mentioned that now the private sector is possibly taking over since the banks are resisting in terms of lending, so now you have syndications and stuff. So my question then becomes, do you see the role of cross-border collaboration enhancing?
No doubt.
Okay.
I mean, the Canadian investors are like beating the drumbeat on why is it that you guys can't get a clue on this in terms of where it's going. The same thing for the Nordics and many of the Europeans. They're pushing. At the same time, they're also trying to learn from us, because there's things that are happening in the United States from a sustainability standpoint that are pretty great. And we have maybe a little bit more fluid market, a market that's influenced more by carrots than sticks at the moment. And that gives us a freedom to do things that in Europe, they're like, I've got these rules, and I've got to do this, and I've got to do that. So cross-border becomes all the more important, because we all have slightly different situations, and therefore we're going to have slightly different solutions that we need to learn from. So none of us have the answer. I'd love to say, as someone who's the son of Swedish immigrants, that Sweden has all the answers. They don't. They're just as stupid as the rest of us. But they do have some insights and some things that work that we can learn from, and they can learn from us as well.
Okay, let's move on to Heidi, get a sustainability perspective. So Heidi, your work, sustainability is at the core of your work, what you do. So could you possibly share a project with us where sustainability and resilience was successfully integrated, and what key challenges did you face in the project of that?
Yeah, certainly. And this actually touches on one of the points I made earlier. So recently we completed a climate vulnerability assessment for the Los Angeles County. And this is a large area that incorporates 88 cities, and then also has some unincorporated areas. And this assessment actually had the Buro Happold team partner with private partners in Los Angeles County to do an assessment of vulnerability of people. These people could be at risk because of their age, because of their health, because of their level of income, and then also to assess the vulnerability of places within the county. And the vulnerability assessment came on the heels of sustainability guidelines that were provided in the years before this risk assessment. It was actually the first step of the implementation of the sustainability plan for this very, very large area. Now, California is currently facing increasing risks such as fires and the air quality problems that come with that, high temperatures, and then as a coastal city, of course, it also faces sea level rise and flooding and associated issues that can threaten the infrastructure. And if the infrastructure is interrupted, it of course can have a cumulative effect, a pile-on effect of other things that go wrong that, again, disproportionately affect some people who do not necessarily have a voice. And so part of this assessment was to give voice to these people who are typically not heard. And one of the challenges was really to reach these stakeholders, and this was the benefit of partnering with local communities and organizations who would actually have the interface with many of these vulnerable groups. So after this initial outreach, we created a tool, an interactive tool, which actually maps the entire county. It's an online map that highlights all of the vulnerable areas in terms of the climate risks. And then on top of this, it has a list of possible interventions to counter these particular risks. So this is just the first step in, again, the implementation of the entire sustainability plan. But to understand really on a very basic level, what are the issues beyond what just affects the primary and prime buildings in the large city portfolios was really important.
So you're talking social impact as well, not only
exactly
environmental. Yeah. So I'll jump ahead and talk to you about, you have a long list of certifications. In terms of sustainability metrics and certifications, do you see cities increasingly focusing on climate resilience through these certifications, or encouraging that? I know LEED has started asking about social impact, right? Some metrics there.
Absolutely, this is really interesting. I found not only here in the US, but in the Middle East, where I've been working lately, there's a relatively new certification system called Mostadam, which is roughly equivalent to LEED, but it focuses specifically on the local climate and the particular sensitivities of that area, and taking into consideration future climate scenarios is really important as part of that framework. And one of the keystone requirements, for example, of the community aspect of Mostadam includes thermal modeling of the outside areas, and which is a particular concern of the area, right? So, but I did mention the community, so they have performance rating, which is becoming a lot more prevalent in many of the certification systems, where the focus is not so much on prescriptive kind of values, but of the actual performance of the buildings. But LEED certainly has its own framework focusing on cities and neighborhoods. WELL has a communities rating. Mostadam has a communities rating in addition to the performance rating. So that is certainly something that is emerging. I think also the localized assessments or frameworks such as WEDGE that deal specifically with waterfront resiliency and vulnerability is something that is becoming now more prominent, and I think we can see it deal with specific issues. LEED 5 coming in has an aspect dealing with climate resilience and having to consider that as a requisite. So.
we've talked about this on the panel today as well. So sustainability often involves a long-term vision, long-term view of what to do with the asset. But urban developers, sometimes they feel they need to focus on the short-term gains. I need to make my money back soon. How do you advocate for sustainability in such an environment?
Yeah. So Gunnar had actually already addressed some of those aspects. However, what we find is often that it's really a matter of which market you are in, what approach you would take to promote sustainability in somebody who might have a more short-term perspective. It's the type of asset. If you have a Class A office building in a prime urban environment, there's so much of the requirements for sustainability that's already locked in. It's hard not to have a high-performing building. But it becomes more difficult if you have a residential building out in the suburbs, or a multifamily, where the motivation is not quite as high. So one of the things that we do is, first of all, address the delta that is expected between the capital investment in what is considered a sustainable building and what would be the normal benchmark. And highlighting how small that delta can actually be, or non-existent in some cases. And having actual case studies that can demonstrate this, because if you want to have these conversations where people are really concerned about the economy of a project, it's really important to have clear examples, clear and successful examples. We also find that highlighting the risk aspect of not pursuing resilience in the project or sustainability in the project, where we might anticipate future refurbishment and possible penalties by not kind of aligning with the incoming requirements of a particular city through regulation. So being ahead of that expectation can become quite appealing. And then I think you had mentioned as well the ESG aspect. So many investors are now really interested in the sustainable aspect of their investments, and they want to make sure that it is responsible. And the desire for, even if you decide not to keep a building in your portfolio, but to be able to sell that later on, or even within a short term, how that building performs for a potential investor, a potential buyer in that regard becomes more and more important.
So it's more about education and educating the client and sharing.
I do think there's still some issues with just knowledge, and this is kind of our role to inform where necessary. Yeah.
All right, let's move to Eric and get an architectural perspective. So Perkins Eastman has been involved in numerous projects. Maybe you could share a specific project where your team had to balance aesthetic design with practical resilience measures, because sometimes we get carried away as architects and engineers, and we love beautiful things, right? So.
Well, I think that aesthetics is the surface aspect. And I think when you're talking about resilience, the big thing that we want to try to create is livable communities, and all of the different things that livable communities kind of connote. And I think that means livable streets, livable open space, all of those things that makes people want to live, that you all like about the places that you live in. And this is just one example that I want to really stress, that the resilience efforts have to be at the community level, not at the building level. With all respect to any of the most progressive developers. This example on the left, it's a doctor. It's a fellow in Florida. He built his house to all the current standards. He elevated his mechanical, structural, was strengthened and so forth. But everybody around him got wiped out. And what good is it if your own house, your own office building, your own school is intact when you have no community around you? You can't get to where you need to avail yourselves of all the daily necessities. You have no community. So the community is really the scale at which we need to work at. And we work with developers, we work with the public sector all the time. I think one of the kind of the keys is really to, what we say is kind of make there's enormous infrastructure that's entailed in securing a lot of these communities, both from the water, from flood, from heat, and so forth. And I'm flipping around, I'm sorry, but I think one of the things that we like to think about this, one of the ways we like to think about it is that it has to be hidden in plain sight. Meaning that the infrastructure is very important, but it's something that you can't actually see as dominating the landscape. And this is, I'm sorry about this. This is something that we've done. This is a community that we designed in the Rockaway Peninsula, which got particularly hard hit during Sandy. And there's an enormous amount of infrastructure below grade that happened to make that possible. And enormous kind of investments, I'm having a little trouble with this, enormous investments that needed to be made in order to secure both electrical, the flood protection, and so forth. Now, this is kind of the traditional way, at least in the U.S., one of the agencies that takes the lead in a lot of resilience planning is the Army Corps of Engineers traditionally approach things, which is you protect from the water, you build a wall. And it's kind of a single-purpose infrastructure. The way that we like to think of it is you need to have multiple purposes. So Gunnar mentioned the hesitancy for communities to accept change, for people to accept change. Nobody likes change, right? I get my coffee at the same place I get it every day. I ride my train. I like to have it on time, the same schedule. But how to with all the data, all the technology, all the risk, pricing and so forth, how do you envision a better future while keeping the character of what you have? Things have to change, but you want to hold on to the character of what makes the place that you live special. And so that's what we try to do with trying to create infrastructure that it's incorporated into the landscape, that has multiple benefits. This is in the Rockaway Peninsula. Again, the boardwalk serves as a levee. There's a double dune system that is a habitat for natural and endangered species. That's also recreation and so forth, and also just a place for people to gather. So you need to have to make these investments justifiable, to get the consensus around them, to justify the enormous investments in infrastructure that needs to be made over the next so many generations. You need to be able to envision and create that vision for communities, and also to envision infrastructure that has multiple benefits. For developers, and I'm going to just flip to an example right here in Washington, D.C., sometimes that involves a tremendous amount of technology. This is a development called the District Wharf. It's really for the first time brought our nation's capital out to the waterfront. And we created a lovely waterfront promenade. Beneath this is this enormous amount of very complicated technology. We have holding cisterns for the water to cleanse that and hold before they go out. The water is reused for cooling, for a closed-loop system, for the HVA systems. But again, when you're walking out on this esplanade, you don't see any of that. But yet, that's what's there, and it's necessary to make the rest of the investment secure.
Fabulous. So now, thank you for sharing your valuable insights. Before we wrap up, I have one final question for the three of you. If you could implement one policy or initiative tomorrow to enhance urban resilience, what would it be?
If there's one thing that I could do, if I could wave a wand, and that's saying a lot, it would be for us to sit down in every city and rewrite the code. Period. A lot of our issues come down to the fact that we have ossified our resistance to change through code. And instead of a few dozen pages, it's now hundreds of pages of things that even contradict each other, which make development very difficult. It makes affordable housing very difficult. It makes sustainability very difficult. So I think we need to do a complete rewrite, city by city.
The building code for Gunnar. Eric?
Codes are important. I think it's to reinitiate, to begin, sustain a community conversation with all the players, investors, community members, political leaders, bankers, so forth, designers, to understand that change is going to happen and try to understand how change can happen in a way that's equitable, that's positive, for everyone in the future, and to not stop doing that, because again, the effects of climate change are going to vary. We know the tip of the iceberg right now, and that will require continual planning, envisioning, conversations, and communicating.
So Eric, for stakeholder engagement, Heidi?
On one level, I suspect the answer is probably somewhere around funding. However, what I would love to see as a strategy is like a radical embracing of nature-based solutions. All of our interventions tend to harden up the city, and we create big sea walls to try and mitigate ocean rise, and there are so many different types of green infrastructure, green, blue infrastructure, urban agriculture, that can have effects to soften the edges. When you have a water edge, it can mitigate the urban heat island. It can clean the air from pollutants, and it creates also psychological respite from, the hard edge of the cities.
So funding for Heidi, building codes, stakeholder engagement, and funding. So, with that, I'd like to thank the panelists, and I'd like to open the floor to audience questions. If we have enough time for one or two, we are eager to hear your thoughts, and so please feel free to raise your hand or hand the mic, so we'll try to get through as many as possible with the limited time we have. A question here in the front.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for the wonderful panel. As an educator, I really hope to, including Suhail and Eric, Heidi, Gunnar, that how can we educate the young generation? For example, if it's a younger baby, 3-year-old, or a teenager, 13-year-old, or 25-year-old, who sees the big world problem, but really eager to want to be helpful. But in terms of their major, they might have restrictions in getting things done. But how can we educate them? Thanks. Thank you.
There's a tendency, I think, for us to think about education and communication as very much a one-way street. Like, I have wisdom, and I'm now going to open up your head and put it inside there, and then you'll know everything there is to know. And the reality, just like incursion of water, requires a softness. It requires a back and forth. It requires a dialogue. And it's messy. But to a certain extent, young people, whether they're 3 or 4 or they're 20 or 30, in many ways know a lot of the answers. And they know a lot of the answers better than the old people sitting on this desk or on this table right now. The key is to engage in that conversation. The key is to figure out where we go. And the key is also, there's plenty of things to be frightened of. There's plenty of things to be negative about. Oh yeah, it's a mess. Just turn on the television and you can have a horror show any day of the week. But there is hope. And there is possibility. Even with all the greed and stupidity in the world, human beings are really greedy and stupid. We have been for thousands of years. And we've done amazing things with all our greed and stupidity. We can continue to do good things. And we can continue to make great mistakes and learn from them. I think the key to young people is giving them a chance to screw up. And for all of us to understand that's our job, to screw up, learn, keep moving forward. And we're not going to solve all the problems, but we're going to make it better bit by bit. That, to me, is what the education is about. We're all supposed to learn from this. It's not us getting someone else to get it. It's all of us together.
That's great. Yeah. For me, the big issue would be to encourage systems thinking from a very young age, to make children, students understand that everything is connected. Nothing happens in isolation. everything they do, everything they build, everything they buy has a consequence and is connected down a very long line to other things happening in the world. And for them to be able to fundamentally understand that and start to see that, to me, that's the beginning of, having an understanding of what it takes to be sustainable in all aspects.
Eric, you got some thoughts?
Yeah, I agree that actually we may have more to learn from the younger folks than they have to learn from us. We talk about aversion to change. That's just because we've known a different reality and we like that different reality. But when I think about my own kids, they have not known any other reality. They're living with this, day to day, all these horrible, climate catastrophes and the warming trend and so forth. And they know that that's the world that they're going to be living in. More than anything else. And so, that's something that we've been trying to do in our projects, which is try to actually, probably one of the most enjoyable things of the last several years is we have separate sessions, often just to listen to kids from schools or, just kids in the community on what their views is. Usually for engagement, we usually get people who have a lot invested. And I understand that. They're property owners, they're business owners and so forth. Political leaders, but listening to folks who are younger, this is the world they have to live in, and they know all about this stuff through social media. They know more than any of us because they're inundated with this. So I would flip that over. We have to learn from them.
The only thing I would add to that is brilliantly said, all of them, is lead by example. Regardless of age, people are very smart. Children are very smart. They copy what you do. So if you say something and do something else, they figure it out, that it's just lip service, and that's where greenwashing comes from. So try avoiding that from the very beginning. That's the only thing I would add.
We have another question.
Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Rachel Foreman. I'm an investment manager at the Michaels.
Mic for her, please.
So yeah, sorry, I speak loud. So I wanted to ask, how do you communicate to investors like these climate risk scenarios? Do you tend to start at a 2 degrees Celsius baseline? What's the best way to contextualize some of this? Because it's hard to always put a financial figure to what might happen. We saw no hurricane risk last year, insurance premiums, we were able to negotiate and they went down. This year it's a different conversation with investors. So how do you tend to approach the number side of this?
It's important to understand scale. And that is, we've made the mistake repeatedly talking about we need to do this sustainable thing because you're gonna save $50,000 a year on your energy costs. To an investor in a $50 to $100 million building, they can't see that. It's too small to see. They can't make a decision based on that. But they can make a decision based on how much more successful will this building be if you take a certain path. And that's what we learned 20 years ago when we started implementing ESG and using sustainability as a way to market a building. We realized, we can make a lot more money and the building's worth more. That institutional investors are very intelligent people, but they behave stupidly. And by design, they're there for one reason: to deliver better risk-adjusted returns. They have to be able to put all of this into a number, and they have to have a high level of certainty that what we believe to be true is true. They're trying to predict the future, which is really hard. I defy any of you to predict the future. We can't. It's really, really hard. But they have to not only predict it, but put money on it. And it's not their money, it's someone else's money that's going to fire them if they go wrong, right? So they're thinking in terms of what can I be certain about? There are examples, abundant examples everywhere of the success of these kinds of programs. That's helpful, so focus there. You have a 100-year-old building here in New York City that was an old, tired building 20 years ago that no one wanted to lease, called the Empire State Building. The most valuable part of it was the observatory up on the top. By implementing a lot of sustainability features and energy-efficient features within that building, they've made it one of the most successful office buildings in New York at a time when only new buildings are doing well. That's an example of why you want to do this. Another example of why you want to do this, again, comes back to insurance. If you have a more resilient, sustainable building, your insurance costs go down. So now we're doing it very simply. We're saying, look, you do this, you save money. And you can stretch that out over 10 years, and you can take out some of that uncertainty, and now you're able to deliver to your constituents exactly what they're asking you to do, which is deliver reliable, risk-adjusted returns over time. So when we talk about these things, talking about the macro and sea level rise, although interesting and important, it's not the way to convince. What we have to talk about is how is your building, your community, your neighborhood going to be successful versus not successful? You have to think both short-term and long-term at the same time. And think about costs only in the context of the scale of the investment they're making. You know, to me, $100,000 is a lot of money. If I could save $100,000 every year, I'd go whoopee. But for a $50 to $100 million building, you can't even see it. So keep that in mind when you're communicating.
Show me the money, essentially.
It is. I hate to say it. Absolutely. It is show me the money. And that's an unfortunate part of it, especially given that all the parties here are intelligent people who can think broader, big picture. They're capable. They do it all the time. But their job is to show the money. So they have to understand where that's coming from.
Any more?
Yes. I'm real estate broker. I'm Yun Wendy Wang. In my mind, for sustainability, the matter of the politicians. But from your speech, maybe it's becoming an industry. I'm thinking about how can I join this industry? How can I make money from this industry? Could you please give me how to entering this industry? Thank you.
Would you like to talk about your career path, or should I direct her to NYU?
I hear it's a very good school.
Oh, it's one of the best.
I'll briefly speak about my career path. As I said before, I started in design, interior design, then migrated via a couple of things to become an architect, and then I joined an engineering firm. But through all of this and developing from that very first design job where I was working for a financial house, actually. But that financial house had a big interest in sustainability even at that time, which is a time that I would not even want to mention here. But they started to invest already in sustainable buildings in the previous century, right, some time ago. And that sort of triggered this kind of aspect of, yeah, we can actually make a difference. And then more and more, as I increased my education and focused more on the building scale, I realized that you can specialize in certain aspects of sustainability, combine that with design, and now I've taken a step out of that pure design and sort of joined a more consulting kind of perspective, and I can put all of that combined experience together in what I do now. So that's one approach. Consultant.
Eric, you want to share?
First, I thought when I was hearing that your question was, how can you make money in this field? And I'm not the one to answer that one. Sorry, I'm an architect. However,
I can show you how to spend money.
Oh, hey. However, I will say that, you know, when I think about I also teach at NYU as well, and when I think about this young new generation coming up, there's so much extraordinary interest in these fields: sustainability, resilience, climate adaptation. And, you know, I feel, having grown up with the technology generation and all my friends who now retired, and I could live over their garage someday, maybe if I'm lucky, in California. But, you know, they set out to change the world, and they did, with all these incredible things with information technology and internet and so forth. So, you know, there's a huge, you know, expansion of the industry in all sorts of sectors besides consulting and education, investing, and, you know, I think that there's lots of opportunities. There's another conference that I've been going to for several years called Green Build. Sorry, I have to mention a competitor. It's the US GBC, Green Building Council. And, you know, when I first started going to that a number of years ago, it was really just true believers and kind of movement people, like myself to a certain extent. The last couple of years, and I go, there are people from, government, or all levels, federal, state, local. There are people from, finance, insurance, corporate world. And so I think that it's baked into just about everything, all decisions that are made, all planning. And so there's lots of great opportunities. So, yeah.
I would echo that, but I would also say something that might be a little uncomfortable, is that there is no algorithm for building a career, period, especially in a time of change. I would not recommend necessarily following the career path I took. I started in the arts. But at the same time, I'd recommend, if you did do something like that, how awesome for being able to see how systems work and how people are saying something different from what they're doing. And that built my career. But it didn't happen step by step. It was a mess. And to a certain extent, bring whatever you are to wherever you are. That sounds airy-fairy and difficult to kind of act upon, but at the end of the day, what sustainability and resilience needs is for everyone who has whatever they have to bring it to the party, to do what they are. Do it to your utmost. Follow what you're most passionate about. Be in the space. There is no one educational path to get there. There is no one career path to get there. And in fact, whatever paths the four of us followed are no longer there. It's a new path now. It's already been flooded and burned. So now it's time for a new path and new ways to do it. So part of what is challenging about that is that there is no formula for you to get there. There is simply you being there, making marvelous mistakes, finding insights, and trusting that who you are, whatever that is, whatever abilities and flaws that make up you, are valuable in this environment. Your voice, your ideas are valuable. They could be wrong. More often than not, they are. But it's valuable that you're there and that you're learning from it as we go forward. So I'd encourage everyone, be careful of this is the prescribed path. Understand that parts of that might be useful for you, but some of it could be absolute bunk. Follow who you are and where your passions lie, and always have that beginner's mind. There's a reason why young people are teaching us what to do. By default, they're beginners. Everyone has to be a beginner all the time. And as soon as we think that we've got this, that we're experts, that's when we fall on our face. And all of us have done that repeatedly. And that's why, for some reason, they asked us to come up here on stage.
To embarrass us in public. Yeah, no, well said, everyone. And I'll just build on what Gunnar said, that something that everyone in the audience in this room can do, and anyone who's watching this can do. Everyone is part of real estate, as Gunnar always says. They just don't realize that everything is real estate, okay? So if you live in a home, if you decide to renovate and resell it or retrofit the home, you can make sustainable choices. It doesn't have to be a multi-billion-dollar industry that you're overwhelmed by. You have this small house, you can buy something for $100,000, even in New York, might not be in Manhattan, but in New York, you can make sustainable retrofits, make certain choices. You will have an impact on the next generation, whoever will be purchasing the home for you. So you can have social impact there, you can have an environmental impact there. Okay, so you don't have to think huge. Everyone here can make a difference. So take that and start small, and you will find your path. You will find a better path, is what he's trying to share, right?
No.
Anybody else? Any more for any more? Welcome. Any more for any more? We're good? Okay. Well, thank you. I appreciate it.